Alright guys, welcome back to class. I think in the last segment we had summarized not just the three games that we discussed as part of game theory in IR, Prisoner's Dilemma, the game of chicken, the game of stag hunt, but we had also looked at that interaction between strategic uncertainty and conflict of interest. So we had primarily looked at three scenarios. A, that involves very high conflict of interest but low strategic uncertainty. Low strategic uncertainty means you're pretty sure about how the other state will behave. So usually you look at such scenarios through the optic of the game of chicken. Um, we also have the combination wherein you look at high conflict of interest and high strategic uncertainty. That basically signifies the fact that you're not really certain about how your rival is going to behave, and that is the reason why you have some kind of high strategic uncertainty relating to their behavior. So games that deal with military modernization, arms buildup, etc., were said to be games that fall under the prisoner's dilemma category. um, the third set of games would be those where there is very low conflict of interest but high strategic uncertainty. Now, low conflict of interest would mean that there's nothing much in principle that states would disagree on. So, the examples that we suggested relating to uh, pursuing agendas on improving the environment, pursuing agendas on improving, say, for example, um, control of transnational crime, etc. All of them fall in the categories of very low conflict of interest, but nonetheless, you're not really certain whether the kind of commitments you adhere to would be equally adhered to by the partner. And it's very important for the partner to adhere to the conditionalities that are part of pursuing that particular strategy, because without that, it may not mean much in terms of your ultimate ability to hunt for a stag. You might just be only ending up getting a much smaller kind of reward. So, when you look at any kind of agreement around environmental agendas, so the list of agreements here basically sequentially indicate the fact that there was always a temptation to avoid hunting the stag. That's why I sort of kept the timeline also sequentially. So if you look at what started out as an exercise in the 1990s, due to the fact that there were very weak national commitments, subsequently, even when the issue of global warming becomes a very serious issue, you still find that nations are not willing to have strong commitments as far as cutting down on their carbon footprint is concerned and making other changes is concerned. And so you had again another round of negotiations that were part of the Copenhagen Climate Summit meetings, but there was still disappointment because countries were not willing to put um, pen on paper as far as binding targets were concerned. And then we reached the Paris Accord, which was quite significant in the sense that there was a target to bring the global warming levels to below 2 degrees Celsius, below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Um, but again, here we find that as on date, I think Iran, Libya, Yemen, and the US have either not ratified it or withdrawn from the Paris Accord. So, you can see that there is improvement, but again, when you look at the most powerful country in the world, also not sort of wanting to have national commitments that ensure that the stag is hunted, you could imagine that eventually it might just disperse the kind of efforts that are aimed at improving the environment. Again, the scenarios that we laid out, if you look at the combination of strategic uncertainty and conflict of interest in each of these, you would be able to clearly identify that the nuclear war will fall in the game of chicken, and the arms buildup would be a prisoner's dilemma game, and any issue concerning global governance which has low conflict of interest would then be your game of stag hunt. And it was in this context that we had laid out a couple of contemporary examples, and maybe just to go through the examples. When we talk of the idea of the recent tariff wars, so basically you have to sort of look at which particular payoff do we eventually end up with when we pursue a tariff war strategy. Tariff war strategy, basically somebody invokes a tariff, there is a tit for tat reaction, and then there is some kind of a domino effect as far as everyone sort of either holding on to the barriers to entry that they have, or maybe complying to the requirement that they should bring down their tariffs. So there is some kind of an effect. Ideally, when we look at the kind of negotiations that would have gone into the setting up of institutions like the World Trade Organization, the idea very clearly was to ensure predictability, right? Predictability in your trading environment. It should not be the case that amongst 200 odd countries, you have 200 odd tariff regimes and various kind of rules relating to entry of goods into the country, various kinds of rules that either make it easier for some to trade or make it very difficult for others, right? So it should have been ideally an environment that is built on the idea that every nation is your most favored nation. That is how the MFN principle came to underline the working of the WTO. So basically, if we go by that principle, one would assume that there might have been challenges to countries reducing the tariff levels, because in order to have your economy kept open, you are sort of undertaking the risk of allowing international competition into your country and thereby exposing your own domestic players to international competition, right? So that would have been the short term kind of worry on the minds of countries. But in the long term, I think exposure to international competition would have shored up the domestic capabilities of these companies in a manner such that overall the outcome would have been efficient as far as the market results were concerned. And if you look at net benefit to consumers, I think consumers would have in the long run benefited from this exercise. Just to give you an example, if we were to look at India, for instance, pre-1990s, you were looking at a mixed economy. 1990s, we accede to the Washington Consensus, open up, liberalize, and then gradually you find that net, the nature of industries that began to emerge in India sort of were becoming more and more competitive. You were moving away from maybe family-run businesses which had scaled up to maybe several other businesses that could scale up on a global level. And for consumers, the advantage was that the competition within the Indian market ensured that earlier, while you might be purchasing products where there were limited suppliers, and therefore the market price would have been determined just by a few players, now with free market competition, you were pretty sure that the consumers would be getting a reasonable deal as far as the overall outcome was concerned. So that was the basis of why initially the effort to sort of stabilize the trade environment was made. And now when we look at tariff wars, the idea is that in terms of payoffs, if we don't end up talking to each other and negotiating, you might end up choosing the defect outcome for each country, which means that in the end you might be actually choosing a worse off kind of outcome compared to what you had chosen right at the beginning, right? So this is where the idea of trade wars, tariffs that sort of create conditions where everybody becomes worse off, end up giving you a payoff similar to the prisoner's dilemma outcome, right? And those of you who might think that couldn't it be a game of chicken, I think for that you will have to look at individual negotiations that happen between countries. So US and China, right? And there you can sort of think of, whether the first round of tariffs that were imposed in 2018, how did the Chinese react? The Chinese did face some serious domestic impact as a result of that. If you look at manufacturing, it went down in China. If you look at, of course, exports would go down, but if you look at domestic unemployment rates, official rates might sort of ring some alarm bell, but it's always conveyed as being under control. But official unemployment rates are over the 5% mark, right, which is not considered to be the ideal level. But unofficially, it has created serious impacts, right? So as a result of this, do we find, in individual settings, do we find countries either complying, in which case they have swerved, or do we find them continuously driving, in which case you might end up with one of the outcomes that we discussed in the game of chicken, right? So maybe if you look at the last 7 years, right, that was the time period when the first round of tariffs were introduced. Maybe if you look at the initial years, it might have been clearly a game of chicken where there was some swerving being observed, because at that point in time, as I mentioned, there was a hit to manufacturing, there was a hit to cyclical unemployment numbers. But now, if you look at the changes that might have been brought about by the economies themselves, right, the adjustments that they would have done domestically, and domestically they would have done several adjustments. So if you are familiar with what the Chinese have been doing over the last 7 odd years, you may be familiar with phrases like dual circulation strategy, right? I don't know if you came across this strategy. So this is directly the consequence. I mean, I'm just trying to explain how the game of chicken itself can be operationalized when you look at specific instances, right? So if you look at recent years, the Chinese would have focused more on developing the domestic sector as being capable for absorbing some consumption. They would have sort of looked at alternate markets where they can sell their products. And now their strategy might be slightly different compared to the payoffs that they suddenly faced in 2018, right? So today, when you look at the strategies relating to driving head on or swerving, it might be a different outcome that you see as a result of the countermeasures that countries take. So I think that's as far as the topic of trade wars is concerned. I think the next segment that I had announced is again a very interesting dimension of IR, which we briefly introduced when we were discussing liberalism and various facets of liberalism. So when we discussed interdependence liberalism along with, say, republican liberalism, etc., I think we had exposed ourselves to the idea that beyond how the realists might be looking at in terms of how there is the international system that affects the behavior of states, and within the international system, states still remain the paramount actors. I think in contrast to that, liberalism had exposed us to the idea that states are important, but non-state actors are also important, right? So when you look at how overall international relations plays out, I think in the last 20 odd years, the importance to organizations like, for instance, say Greenpeace, right? An organization that works in the realm of environment, or for instance, the importance that transnational corporations have, right? Different transnational corporations, multinational entities that operate across different areas in the world, the kind of influence that these entities might be having. I think intuitively for us, even if we don't look at actual numbers, because of course each of these is a very distinct area of study, but broadly, even if we look at the impact that many of these organizations have had, I think it would not be fair to suggest that non-state actors do not have any relevance in the international system. I think that would not be a fair reading of how the international system has actually evolved. Um, Certainly, if you look at the progressive importance of transnational actors, we begin to appreciate the view that international political economy scholars take. They have a view that, first of all, the international system is not just about security, right? So that is very clear on their mind, that when you talk of international relations, it seems to be that the conversation almost gets headed to the direction that international relations is about security dilemmas, it's about security competition, it's about interstate rivalry, it's about power, it's about hegemony, and spheres of influence, and this is the only thing that is there in the international system. But I think this is far from reality. Today, when we look at the kind of response that is beginning to emerge to even the kind of tariffs that are being invoked by the Americans, the fact that there are other regional blocs that are coming together in order to say maybe have some kind of cohesive strategy, basically means that you're not looking at unitary actors, states, but you're looking at maybe even collective responses by regional groupings to these developments. And these collective responses, although we may not be able to tell what shape eventually they might take, but you might find that eventually at a regional level there might be currency swap arrangements, there might be greater acceptability to settle trade in your own domestic currency as opposed to the existing regime. You might have maybe political rivals becoming some kind of economic partners. I mean, if you look at what's happening in terms of bilateral relations like India and China, it seems to be that the recent trend relating to tariffs has actually allowed countries to go beyond the traditional rivalries that they might have had to even sort of forge some kind of common strategies. Of course, one is not overstating the fact that you suddenly have great amount of bonhomie, etc. But the point here is that there might be other dynamics also related to the international system that are not about security alone, right? There could be other dynamics that also address the issue of political economy, and that's what IPE scholars tend to suggest, that the international system is not just about international security, it is about other agenda items. And it's not just states who are important actors, there are transnational actors that are important. Um, Again, you're not simply looking at interstate relations, you're looking at maybe the role that organizations have across several sort of countries. And in terms of outcomes, while the realists might have had us believe that conflict is the only outcome that is foreseeable, I mean, even if it is a different century, they would say that history repeats itself after a certain period of time. But the IPE scholars would suggest that the outcomes can also be in terms of international cooperation. You can have um, maybe a group of countries coming together and putting up a preferential trading agreement. You can have maybe a larger number of countries coming together and putting up a regional trading agreement. You can have an entire set of countries putting up maybe an international organization like the WTO itself, right? So at different levels, cooperation can manifest itself. It could be at the level of a China-ASEAN free trade area, it could be at the level of The South Asian Free Trade Area, of course, something which has been very inactive since the days of SAARC, right? The South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. But nonetheless, there are different initiatives that states take wherein the outcomes could result in international cooperation as opposed to the predominance of conflict when you look at it through the realist perspective. In terms of the structures that you get to see, again, while realists would have us believe that the system is based on anarchy, as we had discussed, and I won't go too much into that, but clearly IPE scholars offer a new sort of optic wherein they say that, you know, the international system is not just anarchy, but it could also be, you know, a way of um, functioning through international institutions, right? So the fact that, you know, you are able to sort of arrive at some kind of rules relating to trading, going back to our example that we just discussed, basically that the logic of the WTO was meant to ensure predictability, was meant to ensure that states don't individually tend to sort of discriminate when it comes to their trading relationships. And therefore we find that, you know, the international system could be about new structures that sort of mediate the relationship between states. When we talk of transnational actors, it could take different forms. Transnational actors would involve private parties moving goods, people, money, information, right? So it could take different forms, whether it is a monetary institution, whether it is maybe a social media giant, and so on and so forth. And there are different impacts that they could have in how the interaction between states and the people living therein gets regulated, right? So the impact that transnational actors have could take the form of sensitivity, right? Sensitivity means that if tomorrow I enforce a blockade, maybe near my border with Nepal, temporarily, if I ensure some kind of blockade in my border with Nepal, maybe in the next couple of days, the obvious impact would be that there would be some shortage of goods that are entering into Nepal. As a result, there would be maybe longer queues at the petrol bunks which are there, or maybe there is some shortage of other essential commodities, and maybe there might be a spike in prices. So there is some element of sensitivity as a result of the improved trade ties, the improved connectivity that has resulted over the years. And when does sensitivity change to vulnerability? Of course, if Nepal is able to adjust to that particular shock by finding alternate suppliers or by finding alternate materials, right? In that instance, we can say that, okay, it is not vulnerable. You know, it still remains in the realm of sensitivity, but the moment, you know, you find a situation where the other country is not able to adjust to that shock, either in terms of finding alternate suppliers or in terms of alternate products, very clearly it becomes vulnerable, right? The processes also become pluralistic, become fragmented, become complex through these new actors, issues, processes. So there would be, like, you know, an entire set of debate on how transnational actors tend to undermine sovereignty. You must have heard those kind of debates that emerge as a result of maybe the influence that social media has, maybe the kind of technologies they introduce to your phones. A lot of these decisions that you see, say for example, banning of TikTok. Banning of TikTok was primarily due to the argument. I'm not saying that the argument was valid or invalid, but the argument was that, you know, you get exposed to maybe a positive kind of a spin that is introduced through such technologies relating to the country, and therefore, you know, that may not be considered to be good as far as, you know, your foreign policy is concerned, that there is some influence in your country relating to another country that you don't find quite good as far as, you know, undermining your sovereignty is concerned. So clearly these processes aided by technology have over time become complex, become fragmented, and certainly pluralistic, because there are multiple actors, not just states. And when you look at the sum total of all of these developments, whether in trade, whether in finance, whether in social networking, etc., you find that state preferences about the management of world politics tend to be positive sum outcomes rather than zero sum outcomes, as the realists claimed, right? Um, Overall, even if you don't have world data right now relating to trade investment, it would be sort of safe to suggest that um, there seems to be some positive correlation between how over the years more and more countries have become integrated into the trading system, and therefore maybe there has been an improvement in the lives of people who earlier might have been cut off from the kind of earlier trade regimes that would have existed, right? I mean, of course, this what I'm saying intuitively, it sort of in a way gets confirmed when you look at overall the kind of integration that has taken place, overall the kind of participation that you see happening in different international institutions. And therefore IPE scholars suggest that the outcomes that you see in the international system need not always be a zero sum exercise, right? Zero sum basically means that if there is some gain that one country has, it necessarily has to mean that you lose out, right? So if somebody in your neighborhood improves in terms of either economic growth rates, etc., realists would tend to see that from security minded competition, and therefore the fact that okay, they seem to be growing faster and therefore you seem to be losing out. But IPE scholars need not see it that way. They would see it in the manner that, well, if somebody is growing faster, there could be spillover effects, and as a result of that, even the neighbors tend to grow by a few fraction percentage points every time your neighbor grows, right? And the last bit, that governments will not override interests of transnational actors. I think over the years, um, this interaction seems to be sort of having its own ups and downs, right? There have been instances where governments would want to sort of exert their sovereign authority as far as maybe some of these technologies or access to markets, or even their conditions relating to how these firms operate are concerned. And there would be other instances where transnational actors might have so much of influence that they can actually bring about maybe a revolution in a particular place. So it varies, right? In some places you might have restrictions, but the thing is that the restrictions arise because the governments are aware of the potential impact that these transnational entities have. But in other places, they might end up even overriding the conventional governments that are in power, right? So these are some of the underlying points that are part of the international political economy approach. Of course, we will be discussing the IPE approach in far more detail when we get into the specifics of conflict and economic interdependence. So when we study different aspects of economic interdependence, we would be looking at how bilateral economic ties can actually affect outcomes, right? Bilateral economic ties, do they always end up making another state vulnerable, uh, or can there be situations where bilateral ties do not affect the behavior of states, um, and so on and so forth. So we look at those in detail, but just for this introductory discussion, you are looking at an approach in IR wherein the importance that non-state actors have, transnational actors have, private actors have, are set to even shift basic state preferences that exist. So if the idea in realism was that uh, there is only rationality defined in terms of survival, and survival ensured through accumulation of military capability, and the rest of it just being secondary to that. IPE scholars would suggest that, well, transnational actors can actually shift state preferences. um, Examples that come to mind, maybe the fact that organizations like the European coal and steel community, for instance, the impact that that organization might have had in coalescing the interests in Europe when it began, post years and years of conflict. Maybe that did play an instrumental role in coalescing the interests within Europe, and they were able to move from one organization to a spectrum of organizations that subsequently regulated interstate behavior in the European theater, right? So from one basic organization that was able to change preferences of states, you moved into different levels of regional integration, right? And you can think of similar examples, even vis-a-vis the kind of improvement that might have happened over the years, say between India and the US. It would be fair to suggest that the role that some companies have played, right? Some transnational companies have played in terms of the kind of preference formation that might have emerged in India towards the US, or in the US towards India, particularly if you look at the competitiveness of the Indian services industry, right? It is not very difficult to see that there might have been some positive influence that these companies in the services sector played, which resulted in maybe a favorable approach that the US had towards the idea of H-1B visas, towards the idea of maybe more and more promotion of Indian services sector, etc., right? So there are transnational actors that can shift basic state preferences, right? And this approach in international political economy basically challenges the autonomy of the political agenda, right? So while realists would have always kept the primacy of the political agenda on top, IPE scholars are saying that, well, that might be one agenda, but there could be so many other things that can actually shape state preferences, right? So some examples which are mentioned here relating to US economic development, matters of stability, the role of multinational corporations, the kind of impact it might have had on issues relating to openness, protectionism. These are not all foregone conclusions. I mean, there might have been phases where there might have been restrictions, there might have been phases when the positive impact that some of these industries began to show resulted in maybe a strategy of opening up, more liberalism, etc. So strategies, preferences tend to change as a result of the interaction that you see between states. And here also a brief discussion, since we are discussing the role of non-state actors and the fact that there is also primacy to other agenda items beyond just the political. I think a brief discussion of soft power also becomes interesting. What is the idea of soft power? I mean, when you look at realists and you talk of hard power, you are very clear that you are talking of military capability, right? So can there be another power which is not hard but is able to influence preference formation? And that's where we get to a discussion of soft power. So soft power is the ability to affect others through the co-optive means of framing the agenda, persuading, and eliciting positive attraction in order to obtain preferred outcomes. Simply put, soft power basically means your ability to influence another state to do what you want it to do without using force, right? That's a very simple and basic way of looking at soft power. Your ability as a state to influence another state, to pick up the choice, to take the strategy, to choose something that you want them to choose without use of force, right? So soft power includes intangible factors such as the power of institutions, ideas, values, culture, etc. I think the example that comes to mind is the use of, say, for instance, Hollywood by the US, right? So, how does the idea of soft power get manifest through Hollywood? So, if you look at an underlying theme of Hollywood, I think one cannot miss a couple of qualitative factors that are underlined through those movies. One, that if there is a crisis to humanity, or if there is some kind of global crisis, or if there is some kind of intergalactic crisis, then the US would be there to save the world, right? That is one underlying feature. The next underlying feature would be a certain interpretation of democracy, a certain interpretation of electoral democracy, a certain interpretation of human rights, liberties, individual rights, etc. Those would be visible, right? Now, you could make countries choose these options either by use of force, which you would do when you intervene militarily and you want to topple a government because that government is authoritarian, or you want to topple another government because of the unattractiveness of that government pursuing maybe certain kind of weapons, etc. You could do that through military, but in the long term, if you are able to sort of influence domestic audiences by the fact that maybe tyranny is not a good idea, maybe the idea of subjugating individual rights, individual freedoms to an authoritarian state is not a good idea. If you are able to embed that idea in the long term, I think you can pretty much influence outcomes and preferences in that particular entity in the long term without the use of force. I think that's the idea of soft power. Over the years, I don't know if you've come across these terms, public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, particularly in the last 2 decades. It has gained a lot of currency. The public diplomacy division of different countries that work towards maybe encouraging interaction between the intelligentsia, or maybe exposing domestic audiences here to foreign scholars and other works. That's one. Cultural diplomacy, again, some countries use that particular phrase as part of their diplomacy, wherein maybe the cultural diplomacy section of the Indian embassy might be promoting, say, yoga in different countries. So you have formally the usage of these distinct divisions within your foreign policy apparatus, which basically tells you that, well, there is some acknowledgement that soft power seems to have some influence. Now, some might contest the idea that soft power is not the equivalent of hard power, and it does not really affect choices. But I think in the long term, through the impact that maybe soft power has had in the way, say for example, bilateral ties between the US and Japan have changed. So if you look at the post World War II context, I think the ability to change the way the average Japanese might be thinking about the US, I think soft power would have had a very important role. I mean, that was not achieved by the use of hard power, right? The use of hard power produced some negative impacts post World War II, and there was a lot to be done to rectify that. And how could that be rectified? It could only be rectified by having an open, liberalized environment wherein there is movement of traders, wherein there is movement of business persons, wherein there is movement of students spending semesters abroad. And when you look at the cumulative sigma of all of these, year after year, decade after decade, after about 30-40 years, it's fair to assume that there would have been an impact that the education system would have had on the way people would be thinking about what traditionally might have been considered to be a foe or an enemy, right? So I think the idea of soft power and how it works clearly is the fact that you have government, using different aspects of soft power. It could also be education. So when you look at different scholarships that are being offered by, say, for example, um, the US, and the Fulbright scholarships that they offer, or by India, the ICSSR scholarships that they offer in different countries. Basically, the idea is to sort of have that kind of soft impact through different programs. Um, it need not just be education, it is also through Bollywood, for example, that a lot of connections that India has very strongly in Central Asian republics is through the impact that Bollywood has had, right, in those countries. And that is in no small measure trivial, because a lot of positive goodwill that is generated in those countries towards India is because those people, they must not have traveled to India ever. They may not be seeing too many Indians as far as their local markets is concerned and tourism is concerned, but only through Bollywood they would have had formed a certain opinion relating to India that sort of accounts for goodwill, right? So the government using soft power could use the media, the internet, different kinds of programs, and you basically want to influence the foreign public, um, which through media, through the internet, through public opinion, is able to then have an influence on their own government and the preferences that their governments take, right? So the impact that Bollywood has in different parts of the world, maybe it translates to uh, some amount of receptiveness for India, for Indians in those places, which then translates to how their governments might actually be looking at India in the long term, right? So I think that is the basic idea. I also have a couple of examples here just to um, sort of give you an insight as to where soft power is manifest. Maybe the details we'll take up in the next class as we move into the next section. But I think for now, we can bring today's class to a close.